Hello, everybody. Please turn your microphones off. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. The research program on the theory and practice of international relations at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens welcomes you back for another exciting round of virtual, hybrid, and live events and lectures, and webinars. And in this exciting academic year, at least for many of us, we aspire to continue to connect distinguished academics, amazing scholars, scientists, budding researchers, and students from around the world in this exciting journey into the theory and practice of international relations. I remind that the purpose of the distinguished virtual lecture series and of all virtual and live events organized by the research program is to open the doors to distinguished scholars and practitioners and to many other amazing researchers and academics from the international and Greek communities to spread their knowledge, research, and expertise about their areas of interest to students, researchers, world affairs enthusiasts, and the general public who might not have the opportunity to engage with them and their ideas in other ways. For this to be achieved, we have an amazing team that works behind the scenes diligently. So please allow me, before we start, to thank warmly Ms. Stella Miliotti and Mr. Dimitris Polalis, but also the director of IIER, Dr. Haralabos Tsardanidis, for his relentless support and guidance, without whom the organization of those virtual and live events would not be possible. Tonight, we have the pleasure to host a trailblazer in the field of international political theory, distinguished Professor Richard Ned Lebow. Professor Lebow, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It is an honor and pleasure to be here with you and discuss with you.
It is my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Dr. Lebow is a Professor Emeritus of International Political Theory in the Department of War Studies at King's College London and James O. Friedman Presidential Professor Emeritus at Dartmouth College. He is also an Honorary Fellow of Pembroke College at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of the British Academy. He taught strategy in the National and Naval War Colleges and served as a scholar in residence in the Central Intelligence Agency during the Carter administration. Dr. Lebow has held visiting appointments in numerous renowned universities and research centers around the world. He has authored and edited 50 books and nearly 400 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, with his research focusing on theory and policy. His most recent books are co-edited with Ludvig Norman, Weimar's Long Shadow, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024, Justice and International Order, East and West, co-authored with Feng Zhang, published by Oxford University Press in 2022, and The Quest for Knowledge in International Relations, How Do We Know, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. He's very kind today to give us a taste with his lecture on his forthcoming book, which is co-authored with Feng Zhang and is published by Oxford University Press, will be out in February 2025. Histories, Lessons, Analogies, Wars and Pandemics, hence the title of tonight's lecture. Professor Lebow, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I hope that what I have to say will be of interest to all of you. One factual note before I begin. This project, co-authored with Feng Zhang, that I'm talking about this evening, is under review by Oxford University Press.
Sorry.
I don't want to claim that we have a contract yet, as we don't. We're still waiting to hear from the second review. The first review was very positive. It is always a challenge to talk about a large, complex book in the course of a lecture. There's no way that one can go into the detail necessary to give you a real sense of how this all works. It's somewhat like having a flashlight in a dark room and shining it on the wall, lighting up little bits and pieces of it. I'll do more than that in that I'll try to make connections among the little bits and pieces that I shed some light on, or I hope to shed some light on. I hope that in the question and answer period that follows, you'll ask questions that will be specific and allow me to elaborate at more length on topics I've glossed over or even neglected in the course of my presentation. Let me begin by noting that Feng Zhang, my Chinese collaborator, and I have long been fascinated by the problem of learning. In particular, how it influences how people behave politically, and especially in foreign policy. It's a very difficult issue to address for both conceptual and empirical reasons. You'll see when I begin to unpack some of the concepts involved, just how many of them there are and how difficult it is to pin them down. This is true of lessons, analogies, learning, and trying to decide empirically the extent to which a lesson influenced how policymakers responded to a situation versus their use of a lesson to sell policies that they decided on for other reasons. For both reasons, it's a challenging task. Only fools would do what we did, which is to extend our analysis from foreign policy to public health. We ask how similar and different is historical learning in foreign policy and public health, and how does learning influence actual policy? These are two very different realms, but we find that there are many similarities between them. Let me start by describing the central questions that drive our analysis. First, we're interested in why people formulate lessons. What is it about human beings and the policy world that makes lessons an important way of thinking about the world, about problems, and about responses to them? Why is it that some lessons become learned and others not? As Sherlock Holmes said in one of his famous cases, the key to solving the mystery may be dogs that didn't bark. So here too, we ask ourselves not only what lessons were learned, but why were others not that might have been learned, and indeed that perhaps should have been learned? We next ask, why do some lessons strike a more responsive chord than others? Many lessons are learned, but only a small number end up influencing policy. Why does that happen? Is it a function of the lessons themselves? Is it a question of who's learned the lessons or who propagates them? Or the nature of the problems that policymakers face? A very few lessons go from the repertoire of lessons that policymakers have to becoming deeply embedded in the political culture. In foreign policy in the United States, the so-called Munich lesson is a case in point. I'll argue, and not alone in making this claim, that it's absolutely central to understanding, even foundational to, American national security policy throughout the entire Cold War and now in the post-war era. What is the consequence of a lesson that becomes embedded? Feng and I suggest that it helps to determine what other kinds of lessons are likely to be learned and which will not. So lessons whose assumptions clash with the lesson that is deeply entrenched in a culture are far less likely to be learned than lessons that are supportive of it. And in a more fundamental sense, it may shape in many ways how people think about the social and political worlds. Our book, therefore, differs dramatically from existing books that look at lessons in foreign policy. Almost all of these, and some do it very well. I'm thinking, for example, of Yuan Feng Kang's Analogies at War, his study of the kinds of historical lessons that shaped American intervention in Vietnam. His book and others take particular lessons and document their relevance in particular policies. And you and others have shown just how important lessons can be in foreign policy formulation. We're stepping back and offering a broader view about lessons. We're not focusing on cases, but rather on lessons. We're asking about the life history of lessons. As I suggested a few moments before, why they're learned, why some achieve prominence, why a smaller number become deeply embedded in a political culture, and finally, why some lessons that have achieved this status lose their standing. Why do they decline? In asking these questions, we think that we can not only learn something about historical lessons, but more broadly about needs of human beings and policymakers to think in terms of lessons and analogies, and the way they do it, and how, as a result, policymaking really differs considerably from the kind of process imagined by rationalists and, for that matter, realists. The outline of the book responds to these questions. The second chapter examines the nature of lessons and analogies, because foreign policy lessons are allegedly lessons learned from particular historical events, which are then applied to other events. So somehow they must be seen to have fundamental similarities between the case that generated the lesson and the event to which it's now being applied. So there's a process that goes on here. And when it comes to political learning, it's hardly a scientific process. It's far more determined, we will argue, by political and psychological needs. Lessons are relevant to policy, but foreign policy and all other kinds of lessons serve other purposes as well. They can be means of voicing anxieties, fears, hopes, and the extent to which they resonate with other people lead those who advance them to feel better, either about the problem or the prospects for improvement. Lessons are also central in creating solidarity among people and building national identities. I'm going to argue in due course that one of the reasons why Munich has become so entrenched in American culture is that it contributed to shaping and transforming that political culture. The lesson can't be studied and understood aside from this cultural political context in which it exists. So, after very careful discussions of the nature of learning, of analogies and metaphors, we come to a set of propositions applicable to analogies. Before I come to these propositions, I'd like to say a few words about learning. There are all kinds of ways of framing learning, and I suppose they're all relevant depending upon the kinds of questions you're asking. Learning might just be considered change. We believed and thought this yesterday, we think this today. A more rigorous understanding of learning would suggest that somehow a change in beliefs or expectations or lessons has to somehow be better than what preceded it. And positivists, in thinking about better, would say it has to be more valid. Well, I have a problem with this because who knows the truth and who knows the validity of lessons or propositions? I mean, lessons are based on historical readings of events. And often those lessons are formulated in the immediate aftermath of the events when adequate documentation is not available, when interpretations are very heavily influenced by ideologies and the political needs of people at the moment. History is an evolving process in which new documentation and new interpretations are debated, and over time, understandings of events change. One need only look at our understandings of World War I and its origins in the 1920s, the 1940s, the 1960s, or in 2014, the 100th anniversary, when a wealth of new works came out and offered reaffirmed some understandings, but completely rejected others, offering new insights into the origins of that catastrophic event. Lessons don't evolve the same way. Once they're there, they stay relatively stable, whereas their foundations may be pulled out from underneath them or in some cases strengthened. There's also another understanding of learning, which is Bayesian, which is from statistics and very widely used in social science. And it looks at incremental change on the basis of new information. This understanding, of course, completely finesses whether that change leads to better understandings. What Feng and I do is we rely on Max Weber and American pragmatists who thought that theories, and we argue by extension lessons, should be evaluated on the basis of their utility. Do they tell us something useful about the world? Do they help us frame problems and address them? That seems to us a reasonable criteria. This, of course, then leads to the question of what constitutes success and failure. And here, too, there are issues. Take, for example, the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq. You may remember, you may even have the image in your mind of George Bush making a helicopter landing on an aircraft carrier and proclaiming mission accomplished. This was after Saddam Hussein had been overthrown and American forces had entered Baghdad. Yes, the Americans achieved an initial goal of overthrowing Saddam Hussein. But if one looks at the longer term consequence of the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq, it was a disaster. Rather than making the Middle East a more stable area, it made it less so. It encouraged more terrorism, the fragmentation of Iraq, instead of intimidating, as the administration hoped, Palestinians, North Koreans, and Iranians. It did the very reverse, was a spur to Iran and North Korea developing their own nuclear weapons. So we have to take both short and long-term perspectives on events. And here too, analysis is often more political than it is analytical, with people making different arguments depending on where they are along the political spectrum. So doing science when it comes to foreign policy is something that flies in the face of how the world actually works. On the other hand, to do decent analysis, one has to be scientific and do one's best to use concepts as rigorously as possible and empirical evidence as well as one can to address these questions. But in the end, it still makes learning somewhat problematic. When we come to public health, it's a bit different. And it's different for several reasons. One is that political learning is a project of political leaders, talking heads, journalists, and to some degree, academics, who have varying analytical skills and commitments. Public health learning is carried out by people with scientific training and backgrounds who approach it as a scientific problem, who publish their articles about lessons in peer-reviewed journals rather than internet blogs and newspapers. There's extensive debate, much of it evidence-based. Often a consensus emerges, sometimes not. So we initially thought when we did this project that we would be addressing two very different domains. To our surprise, we discovered considerable overlap, which I will come to in due course. What we did was to develop propositions based on cognitive psychology, motivational psychology, and political science that address the question about why certain lessons are more likely than others to be learned and why certain lessons become more widely accepted and part of a political culture. And we have 7 such propositions. I'll elaborate them in a moment. We then evaluated them in 4 case studies, 2 from foreign policy. The first, the Munich lesson or lessons, which, as I noted earlier, was so central to American foreign and national security policy from literally the beginning of the Cold War until today. It gives us a good handle on a lesson that's become deeply entrenched, but is now losing support and has not evolved, but evolved in the way in which it's used. Feng did a parallel study of the Korean lesson for China. Simply stated, it says that Korea, the Korean peninsula, is the route by which foreign enemies invade China. It's essential to either control Korea or have it in the hands of a friendly power. This lesson was learned by the Ming Dynasty in the 16th century. It was reinforced in World War II because, after all, the Japanese invaded and conquered Korea, then used Korea as a base to attack Manchuria and China. It was applied to the Americans in 1950. And although Dean Russ suggested that the Yalu should be seen as the Rio Grande, that's not how Chinese saw it. In fact, it's not how Mexicans see the Rio Grande either. What the Chinese saw was an American army marching up the Korean peninsula the way the Japanese and the Mongols had before them, with an outcome that in their mind was certain and left in the minds of Chinese communist leaders no doubt that Chinese security required their intervention regardless of the cost. So we look at these two political lessons, and then we just have a sip of water. We then turn to public health. And the obvious case for us was the COVID pandemic. Worldwide, I hate to say a natural experiment, but one in which we could make comparisons within and across countries and regions to see how people had responded and what lessons had been learned. The COVID case is also interesting because it allows us to look at three, not levels of learning, but three waves of learning. When the pandemic was first identified, nobody had any good evidence about the infectivity and lethality of the virus. Doctors and public health officials, for treating COVID and for preventing its spread in the case of the latter, had perforce to look at lessons they had learned from earlier pandemics. And here the question became, which ones are relevant? For China, it was SARS, and the Chinese remained narrowly focused on SARS as the case whose lessons were applicable to COVID. In the West, public health officials saw four possible medical events of the past that were relevant to the present. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, measles, HIV, and SARS. And depending on the country in the West, they emphasize one or more over the others in making initial policy and treatments. So that was the first stage of learning about COVID. The second stage is when evidence becomes richer and allows one to make evaluations of not only the infectivity and lethality of the virus, but the relevance and effectiveness of the medical and public health strategies that have been adopted to deal with it. So stage two of the learning is judging whether or not the historical lessons that you've used at the outset are relevant, and how relevant, and what changes you should make in public health and medical policy in response to your feedback now from the application of these earlier historical lessons. And finally, late in the epidemic or pandemic, and when it recedes, we come to a third stage of learning. That is, what can we learn from this medical event that may differ from past medical events and shape how we can better respond to preventing or treating people when the next virus makes an appearance. So both our chapters on China and the West address these three stages of learning, and we find considerable variation across countries in how this worked. We also, and again, I apologize for not being able to go into the interesting details of COVID and foreign policy lessons for lack of time. I hope it encourages you to read the book when it ultimately appears. We found that learning lessons in public health and medicine, or for that matter, in foreign policy, is only a first step. Somehow, policymakers have to be sold on those policies. This can be very difficult. So there are a few countries where leaders had scientific backgrounds. Angela Merkel in Germany being a case in point, put aside for the moment her politics cap, put back on her science one, and responded as a scientist to the recommendations of her medical and public health officials. But in most other countries, we found that public health and medical officials had no special standing. They were simply seen as another lobby, no different from, I don't know, the trucking industry, the fishing lobby, airlines, all of whom were trying to get governments to do things that were in their interest. Political leaders were as suspicious of public health officials as they were of these other lobbyists. So the public health officials had great difficulty often convincing government officials to treat them seriously and differently. And here too, there's another special problem of science talking to politics. Science, especially early on in a disease, is very cautious about the claims it makes. It hedges its bets. It wants to wait for more data to be fully convinced that this hypothesis is worthy of defense. Politicians want answers, and they want them soon. They have little sympathy for public health officials who say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, this could happen, we need to know this. That's of no use. They want simple answers, and scientists eschew giving simple answers, so tensions arose. The other thing that happened, which again is similar to foreign policy lessons, is that the problem, the pandemic in this case, became intensely politicized, especially in places like Britain and the United States, but in many other countries as well. You had strong communities of anti-vaxxers, of people who denied altogether that there was a pandemic, people who wanted to deny that there was a pandemic because they were convinced it would hurt the economy. Boris Johnson, a case in point. In Britain, they wanted to focus, and Trump too, focus on the economy because it was essential to their survival or well-being as a political official, especially an elected political official. They engaged in denial. And when people engage in denial, they discredit, ignore, dismiss threatening information, and go after the people who dare to provide it to them. So people like Fauci and Deborah Birx or Chris Whitty in Britain became the real objects of hate, and not only by the crazies out there, but by political officials of their own country. So politicization of a lesson creates the same kinds of problems and brings it closer to foreign policy. Let me say a few words about the kinds of propositions that we used, and let me note that our three sources for generating these propositions differ in important ways. First is cognitive psychology. As many of you know, the cognitive revolution has become dominant in the field of psychology. Simply put, it contends that people are cognitive misers. They want to, and indeed need to, address problems with minimal time and effort because life demands that they do. Secondly, that people tend to see what they expect to see, which can be very misleading. And thirdly, that they succumb to a series of heuristics and biases that lead them to make decisions in ways that differ sharply from what we would consider to be rational decision making. Motivational psychology differs from cognitive psychology in arguing that people see what they need to see. Its starting premise is that people seek to reduce anxiety. They do this by trying to escape making decisions that involve risk and commit themselves, that if they're forced to do so, they subsequently engage in post-decisional rationalization, convincing themselves their decisions were right, and become insensitive to information to the contrary, even quite hostile to it. Our third general take on lessons derives from political science and starts from the assumption that political authorities focus on their political interests and those of their country. And that takes priority over other considerations and leads them to engage in some of the same kinds of behavior as predicted by cognitive and motivational psychology. But more importantly, it reverses the arrow of causation. It suggests that politicians focus a lot on selling initiatives to the public or to the legislature. So in doing so, if a lesson is widely accepted by a people, they will couch their policy in terms of that lesson, whether it fits or not. And even if it does, it's likely that the policy was decided on for other reasons. And the invocation of the lesson is a rationalization. So with these general approaches in mind, we came up with a series of propositions, which I'm going to run through very briefly. The first is agency, that lessons that foreground agency are more appealing to people than those who don't, especially in the modern world where people feel like cogs in the wheel and the everyday subject to events and processes over which they had no control and don't understand. Human beings value their ability to make choice. So propositions that focus on it and agency have a leg up. Secondly, are those that portray one's country and people in a good light. And very interesting in this regard, certainly Munich didn't do that to Britain and France because they were appeasers and helped bring about World War II. But the Munich lesson was propagated by Churchill to highlight how he and those who opposed appeasement were right, and how in the end, the good guys, in particular Britain, triumphed over the Nazis. So in a convoluted way, it puts Britain in a good light. People want good people to succeed and bad people to fail. Lessons that connect virtue with success are much more appealing to people than those that don't. Lessons that advance popular political projects appeal to people. And indeed, almost every lesson that we've seen in politics is propagated by people who have political projects that they want to advance and hope that their lessons will gain traction and make their projects, therefore, more appealing to people and more likely to gain their support. Politicians know this, and it's, of course, one reason or one way in which they evaluate public health lessons, thinking that public health officials are doing the same. Lessons that offer simple explanations over complex ones are more acceptable to people. And here we refer to people as cognitive misers. They don't want to make the investment in gathering evidence, making decisions, thinking about cases where a lesson might or might not apply. The simpler it is, the more determinative it is, the easier it is for them to understand, the more vivid it becomes, and the more convincing. People favor action over inaction. One of the classic studies that establishes this has to do with natural disasters. If there are flood warnings, people pour out in large numbers to help fill sandbags, put them alongside the banks of rivers that might overflow. They're very willing to accept the reality of the warnings and to respond with alacrity if asked to help. When it comes to tornadoes, asteroid impacts, things over which they have no control and have no way of really protecting themselves against or preventing, they're likely much more to engage in denial. And this is true with threats and responses. Lessons that resonate with the zeitgeist, with the culture of the moment, are more likely to gain acceptance. So one can look, for example, at how optimistic people were in the 1970s and 80s about the success and spread of democracy. Even more so after the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. Somebody like Francis Fukuyama had the arrogance to say history was ending. I mean, the absurdity of this in retrospect. Today, we're much more pessimistic about everything. And public opinion polls reveal that young people are the most pessimistic. Well, here too, lessons that address or resonate with the general pessimism, optimism outlooks of the moment are more or less likely to find a home. Simple lessons triumph over complex ones because they're easier to understand. And of course, simple lessons are also those that offer certainty rather than indeterminate, rather than being indeterminate. People want certainty, they want complexity. When they're bundled together, as something like the Munich lesson was. It tends to be very much more responsive. And what Feng and I did in our case studies was to, in the first instance, evaluate not only the Munich and Korea lessons, but competing foreign policy lessons. In the case of the US, Pearl Harbor, the Vietnam lesson, and ask why they weren't as successful as the lessons that became dominant. And we make a good case that the lessons that became dominant fit these propositions better than competing lessons. We also find something similar in public health, where you would think that science would trump all, but it's not the case. Psychology of learning and receptivity of people, particularly political leaders, was every bit as influenced by these kinds of propositions as it was politically. We then, in the concluding chapter, we look at the comparisons between public health and foreign policy. It allows us to step back from both and offer a general set of propositions about learning in general and about life history of lessons. So just to give you a teaser here, in the case of Munich, so it was propagated, as I noted, by Churchill in the immediate aftermath of the Munich conference in 1938. It entered the American consciousness in 1947 when Winston Churchill made his famous Fulton, Missouri speech, approved beforehand its contents by Truman. Churchill argued quite absurdly that World War II was the easiest war to ever prevent, and only if Britain and France had stood firm at Munich, they could have done so. He propagated this lesson because he was trying to enlist the United States to take up the cudgels in Europe against the Soviet Union, which Britain no longer had the resources to do, particularly in Greece. Truman fully supported Churchill's speech because he wanted to mobilize public opinion and alert them to this danger, and therefore get support for what became the Truman Doctrine. I mean, this is the right place to talk about this, support for the conservative side in the Greek Civil War on the grounds that the rebels were really agents of the Soviet Union. In fact, they had closer ties to the Yugoslavs, and that the West, if it didn't intervene, it would be seen as a form of appeasement and encourage more encroachments by the Soviet Union and its allies. So Munich had a very particular political valence that led it to be propagated in the US, supported by Churchill, who most Americans thought at the time was the greatest living political figure. It had immediate resonance. Munich, if not spawned, supported deterrence, because if appeasement was catastrophic, deterrence, the willingness and demonstrable will to resist, was what prevented aggression, and in theory, what could have at Munich. And one of the interesting questions here is, this is a counterfactual, right? A what if, that World War II could have been prevented if Britain and France had remained firm. There's no evidence for this. Interestingly, nobody went for many years to look at the German documents to see if there was a case to be made. And what we know, and what German historians argue today, is that Hitler wanted war. He was furious after Munich that the British and French had persuaded him to accept a peaceful settlement, even if it was very one-sided in his favor. 1939, this was March 38. In September 39, he went to war in Europe. In the run-up, he refused basically to engage in diplomacy, fearful that they'd find some way of preventing him from going to war. Hitler might have been removed from office in a coup, but there was no way the man could be persuaded from starting a world war. So this raises a question which I haven't had time to discuss, which is the relationship between history and lessons. And we devote a lot of thought to this in the book and try to show that useful lessons do indeed rest on good history, but that most lessons of all kinds rest on bad history. And occasionally bad history can have a positive effect. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had recently, or just before the crisis, read Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, in which she argued, and really no historian believes this today, that World War I was an accident, that it was the result of runaway escalation that nobody wanted. Kennedy kept this lesson in mind throughout the crisis. It made him far more reluctant to engage in any kind of escalation and to control his military more than he might have otherwise. And we know today that the Soviet Union and the United States came very close to war, not by virtue of the order of either Kennedy or Khrushchev, but due to local commanders, accidents, and loss of control. So there's great complexity here. And we try to both make generalizations in our book, but also we focus on the detail to show how careful we must be about learning and applying lessons and also studying them. Let me stop here.
Professor Lebow, thank you so much for this fantastic lecture. Very, very interesting. Before I open the floor to questions and discussion with the audience, just to summarize, it seems that your research with Professor Zhang focuses on the life history of lessons rather than their application in specific instances, right? And you ask why certain lessons arise in relation to others, why they become embedded in a policy, elite, or the general public, and why they evolve over time or generate correlations and relationships, and how they decline, and how this process differs, if it does, for lessons in foreign policy versus public health. So please, if you would like to ask questions, raise your hand, turn on your microphone, and you can ask directly Professor Lebow and discuss with him. Okay, I see that there are no raised hands here, and I also see...
You could ask the first question.
Yeah. And I also see, and I would like to thank her very much, that Mrs. Kaliva has joined us. She's the General Secretary of Public Health of the Ministry of Health in Greece. Mrs. Kaliva, it's a great honor to host you. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for attending.
The honor was mine, and thank you for the lessons.
Thank you. And of course, Professor Lebow has done an extensive research on COVID and China. He has also collected various data, but we thought that today the lecture would be more theoretically theory focused, but he's open to questions if you would like to pose policy questions. He has done extensive research and discuss about policy and what, as a policymaker, could learn from his research. Mrs. Zigakis?
You need to turn your microphone on.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you, Dr. Lebow, for this enlightening lecture. So my question is, if I remember well, you referred to the denial and suspicion towards COVID and the capitalization of it by politicians. So I would like to ask you if we have had in the past pandemics similar reactions by the public, and whether politicians capitalize on them as well.
Yes.
To today's point.
Yes, may I answer? So the answer is yes, from prior pandemics and in different countries. So if you're a political leader and you tell people that a pathogen is in your midst that could kill millions of people, about which at this point you can do nothing because you don't know much about it, or the only thing you can do is to engage in a complete lockdown to keep people from infecting one another. Both of those responses are disastrous and are likely to lead to very strong opposition to the political leader. People don't want to be told that they're facing an existential threat that the government can't protect them against, and nor do they want the government to overstep its boundary as it did in China and lost considerable support by locking people up and treating them as if they were, the worst kind of criminals who need to be kept from interacting with the rest of society. So if you're not prepared to do either of those, and in democratic countries, that's probably the case, what do? You engage in denial. You convince yourself, or you listen to those advisors who tell you it's not really so bad. It'll be over in a few months. It's no worse than the flu. We can ward it off by eating garlic or taking, anti-worming pills. That the economy will be robust. Just stay with it. It's no worse than the flu. This is a very common response, and it's a form of motivated bias and denial. Occasionally, you had countries who went the other way, but they went the other way because in some cases, like New Zealand, it was relatively easy to do so. So New Zealand is isolated. COVID hadn't broken out, and Jacinda Ardern was very smart in shutting down early. And that kept, for a long time, COVID away. So her popularity rose because the quarantine was not an individual quarantine, but a national one. In China, where you have an authoritarian regime that can do things that democratic governments can't, it did impose lockdown, but it did so, of course, too late. By then, the virus had already spread. And all it did was to get to generate hostility to the regime. So leaders are in very difficult positions. Leaders tend to know they are. And in those positions, it's only a small number of them who behave with policies that we would consider then and now to have been rational.
Thank you, Professor Lebow. Mrs. Kaliva.
It was very surprising for me. You said that political leaders see public health officers like another type of logistics.
Have you had that experience at all?
It's my life because I am a public health officer.
I know, that's why I'm asking you.
And now I am a little bit, but you see, this means that it's not the opinion of all the politicians.
No, I didn't say that. But many.
But it's true. It's true. There, it should be more confidence and more good relations.
Right. But they're two different communities. They speak different languages. They don't understand or necessarily respect one another. It's very hard to get good communication and trust developed. And particularly if you have somebody like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson in office.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Tsardanidis? Professor Tsardanidis, can you hear me? I see that you have raised your hand, but maybe you cannot hear me. Mrs. Mohilna, if I pronounce it right.
Nicoletta.
Nicoletta, I'm sorry.
No problem. It's okay. Good evening. It was a very interesting lecture about the policy, and I have one question about could we say in the other word that public health does mean providing censorship to the policy?
So one of the lessons of 1918 was that not telling the truth to the public only made things worse. This emerged in several European countries and in the United States. When public health officials tried to tell the truth about the Spanish flu, it infuriated politicians because it intensified their dilemma. In several cases, they were not only ignored, but political leaders went and made speeches either on the radio or to large crowds, telling them to ignore public health authorities and claimed that the problem was the fear that people had that was false, not the infection. And of course, people knew this wasn't so because they could see bodies being carried out every day and taken to the morgue of people who had succumbed from the flu. So one of the lessons of 1918 was that even if it's unpleasant news, you need to tell the public that by speaking the truth to the public, you build support for public health authorities and make it easier for them to carry out their mission. And of course, there were two issues that arose in the pandemic in this regard. Early on, public health officials didn't know what the truth was. As I said earlier, one needs good data and evidence before you can make judgments. People didn't know and thought initially in the beginning that through surface contact you could get COVID, whereas it turned out to be mostly through droplets. We weren't sure about masking, about lockdowns, didn't know whether or not there would be vaccines and how effective the vaccines would be, which turned out to be much higher than anybody, including those developing them, thought at the time. So public health authorities trying to speak the truth ended up changing their narrative in the course of the pandemic. public opinion surveys in Europe and the US indicated that as a result, the public sharply lost trust in public health authorities. And once that happened, it undermined their authority in speaking to political authorities. So it's very difficult.
Thank you very much for your information and sharing this. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lebow. Professor Tsaldanidis? Mr. Tomas?
Greetings there. I haven't got much of a question to pose. It's more of a very quick comment, which is the fact that this is by no means the first conference I've attended on this institute or with you guys here at the institute, and you guys do a phenomenal job. So I'd like to thank everybody involved.
Thank you.
Yeah. And literally everybody, including the behind the scenes team you mentioned earlier. That's absolutely remarkable. The amount of effort and the projection you guys put into this, it's really a heart and soul kind of thing. As a Professor Lebow, I am an international relations student. I'm Portuguese, and I'm undertaking my international relations and European studies master's degree. And my dissertation delivery is due in 3 weeks.
Oh, good luck.
Yes, so I'm kind of taking a break from it at the moment, like by being here. But although it's not related to what you study specifically, I'm just here to say that it was a privilege and a real pleasure to, for free, attend one of your lectures, Professor, because I've admired your work since I was in my BA, since my second year or something. So I've admired your work for years, and you really are an inspiration to me and to, I think, many of my friends and colleagues. It's just a delectable mark. You're leaving and have been leaving for many years at this point within our field. And even if it's not international relations and political science, political psychology, and many other fields and areas, it's just a gift to have you with us, and it's a privilege. And thank you so much for coming here and for always making things entertaining, because one of the best things a professor can do is, I absolutely agree with the comment that somebody just posted. I absolutely agree. Absolutely. Wonderful insights for lecture. Thank you for the organization and moderation of this event. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And you've got this ability to entice your audience and to engage your audience in a way that's lighthearted and sort of fun and sort of glitzy, but also incredibly knowledgeable. And I just thank you for that and for being one of my inspirations.
I don't know what to say other than thank you. It's a very.
You probably get this often, but still.
And I'm deeply touched. I've certainly been at it long enough. I retired 2 years ago after 56 years as a professor. But I'm still doing my thing, even though I'm of course, in my 80s now.
And on my part, I would like to thank you very much for your kind words. We really appreciate it, and we are honored by your attendance and everybody's attendance constantly. We truly appreciate it. Thank you. Let me check if there are any other raised hands. I don't see any other raised hands, but I kept seeing Professor Tsaldanidis' hand, and I keep calling him. I don't know if he can hear us or if he has connection problems. And I don't want to move on before he addresses the issue, since he's the director and he's vital in the organization of those lectures.
It was a mistake. I'm okay. I have no other questions.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Great. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Lebow.
Okay, since there are no questions from the audience, Professor Lebow, I have a question. Can we say that foreign policy lessons and public health lessons are subject to genealogies? Because you kept mentioning about the life history of lessons, and if they are subject to genealogies, are they both, or one is more than the other?
So indeed, there are genealogies, and one can apply them equally to foreign policy and health lessons, but there are differences in the way the narratives develop. So with foreign policy lessons, as I said, they're mobilized for particular ends, and people who oppose them mobilize alternative lessons, or make the case that even if this lesson is sensible, it doesn't apply in this case. With public health lessons, what happens is that there's a constant revisiting of the cases from which they were developed. So there was a large literature prior to the pandemic of public health officials, scientists, going back and revisiting Spanish flu, measles, HIV, trying to reassess the lessons that people had proposed on the basis of them. And now, in light of the pandemic, the same thing will happen. The flu is going to be revisited with questions that arose from the COVID pandemic. That kind of recursive process doesn't happen with foreign policy lessons. And if it does, it's restricted to historians and a small number of international relations scholars like me. What happens in the policy world is very different.
Okay.
And look, again, just at Munich, what's happened to Munich is a call for action. And it's an attempt to define other people like Hitler as having unlimited aims and being opportunity driven. It's a call for military intervention. It was, as I noted, mobilized initially by President Truman and used by other Cold War presidents, but now it's become a trope of the far right. It's neocon interventionists in the United States who are the ones who constantly invoke Munich, whether it's dealing with Iran or North Korea, or for that matter, the Palestinians. And it's presidents who don't use it because it would push them into interventions that they don't want. But rather than engage in a debate about why Munich applies or doesn't apply here, they simply ignore what interventionists say, and they're able to do so because they're a marginal political community. And that too, that's a big difference from how learning and debate occurs in public health.
Great, thank you. So can we say that there are things that social scientists can learn from epidemiologists and public health officials that we can incorporate in foreign policy analysis and even in theory construction, especially in international relations? Or you think that there are two worlds apart? Because I'm a proponent of transdisciplinarity, so I think there should be lessons that we can learn.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Finish your sentence.
Oh, no, please, please.
Where I think the similarity is, let's take the issue of arms control or deterrence. There's been a lot of research. Academics have fairly sophisticated understandings of where these kinds of policies work and where they fail, ways in which deterrence and reassurance might be combined effectively rather than relying on one or the other. Having knowledge doesn't mean it becomes policy. One has to sell it to political leaders. And here there's the analogy to political health. So to public health, excuse me. So public health officials had to sell, and some did in some countries better than others, the need to have excess medical capacity, the need to have good national information that could be widely shared. All of the things that they knew or were confident about that would reduce the lethality of a new infection all had to be sold to political leaders. In some countries, they succeeded to a greater degree than others, and in some, very hardly at all. So here they share a fundamental problem. How do people from epistemic communities convince political leaders who think and respond differently to take seriously and implement what they're suggesting? And there's no difference in this regard between the two domains.
So do you think that, especially in IIER theory, we could benefit more from the quantitativists?
I wouldn't, no, I'm
because
not.
Here we see science versus, I don't want to say emotions, but.
No, there we see claims for science.
Okay.
It's not real science. Although, there are clearly problems that are amenable to quantitative analysis. I sometimes do it myself. I'm working on a data set about war at the moment, writing a book about it, and other kinds of issues where case studies, for example, may be a more appropriate means of getting at what you want. It isn't that qualitative or quantitative one is better than the other. Each is appropriate to certain kinds of problems, and together they say more than either alone.
Thank you very much. And since does anyone has a question before I pose my final question, Professor Lebow? If you have a question, this is your chance. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is my final question, and I couldn't, I couldn't let you go without addressing my favorite subject, as we have discussed before, counterfactuals. So the role of counterfactuals in constructing this correlation between analogies and lessons. And you have published an excellent book that everybody should read on counterfactuals. It's called Forbidden Fruit, Counterfactuals and International Relations, published in 2010 by Bristol University Press, where you argue the difference between counterfactuals and so-called factual arguments, which you argue that this difference is misleading, as both can be evidence-rich and logically persuasive. So how does this insight of yours applies to public health lessons and foreign policy lessons and their relations?
Okay. So there's a difference with public health versus political counterfactuals. Mm-hmm. In public health, there is a robust equation about the spread of disease that has a number of variables, and if you measure those variables, you can make reasonably good predictions. You can engage in counterfactuals by varying the value of any of the terms of the equation to see what might happen. So, for example, during the HIV epidemic, public officials did this and found out by doing so that the infectivity rate was particularly sensitive to several things. So it led to the adoption of the distribution of free needles. It led to the stress on safe sex. And all of this derived initially not from data, but from counterfactual manipulations of an equation that was built on prior medical experience. And in the world in general, if you say that X caused Y, you're saying that in the absence of X, there would be no Y, other things being equal. Well, that kind of counterfactual needs to be explored with data and argument if you want to buttress your causal claim. And this is equally true in the political world and in public health.
Okay, thank you very much. And if there is no other question, I would like to thank Professor Lebow so much for this excellent lecture, a truly fantastic lecture, for your generosity to accept our invitation and for your kindness. We're truly honored to converse with you. I would like to thank the distinguished scholars and the students and Ms. Khaliva and other practitioners for attending this lecture. And until the next time, we will issue an announcement about our next lecture. It's not yet finalized, but please check on the website and on social media. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending and for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank